late, but
Yeah, well, this one went down.
we have a quorum, so let's get started. First item on the agenda is to approve the meeting minutes. Everybody's reviewed anybody going to propose?
Motion for me. Approval.
Second.
Okay, any discussion, question,
I
corrections?
have a question. Is there ever any more detail added to the minutes than what's shown here? Just because I'm just curious. I guess they would be long, but because it just says presented for discussion. Doesn't necessarily say what the comments were or any of the.
So a few years ago, we moved from verbatim minutes to action-only minutes because we have the meetings, the audio archived.
Okay, that's right.
And so, so we do use action-only minutes, but at the same time, if there's a particular, action that the ITAC, something significant, we will go ahead and note that in the minutes for sure.
Thank you.
So I think the first and the second were
Second.
Dick and, Ortman and Barnum. Okay.
So all in favor then? Next, public comments. Do we have anybody here from public? Or are there any other comments?
Yes, this is where I have my comments. Two issues that I can put on the table either for discussion now or discussion at a more appropriate time later. And one is this recent, what I call the 2004 allegations from the local press, where it would be appropriate for us to get some briefing, if not now, when. And the second issue is the Gonzalez bill, whether we, in representing the taxpayers for the Transnet dollars, have any concerns about if and when that passes, will it impact the potential distribution of those dollars. I'm led to believe it will not, but if that's true, I think we ought to formally be told it will not, and ergo we don't have any interest.
Right, so regarding the first issue, I mean, we would be happy to share with you any responses that SANDAG makes either to the press or to the public. So we'll do that as soon as that is available. And regarding the legislation that is making its way through the Senate at this time, we could bring back an update for you in September, but keep in mind that by September, most actions through the legislature will most likely already have taken place. But just in its current shape, it deals mainly with SANDAG governance, audit committee, that sort of thing. It does not go into Transnet issues.
And if I'm understanding our previous conversation, that the vast majority of the dictates within Transnet are written into the ordinance of how the money is distributed, although there is reserved for the board of SANDAG some discretion to make changes, but that discretion requires a 2/3 vote.
Right.
So independent of how the Gonzalez bill might structure their normal governance as it relates to Transnet, it will not change.
Right. So if you look at the ordinance, there are several items that are prescribed as lockbox, and only the voters can change those. Other items, the board already has discretion to change those, but it does require a 2/3 majority. So that is not being addressed or touched by the proposed legislation.
So then I come back to my conclusion based on what I'm hearing is that we, representing the citizens for Transnet dollars, really don't have any interest one way or another in this official capacity on that legislation.
Okay. I know you'd also raised the issue of the swap pieces. Andre's here. I don't know if there are any quick questions or if we should, if there's sufficient interest to make that an agenda item for next meeting, perhaps.
I think it would be become totally conversant on it. I think reasonably so, but the one piece in reading the documents that were sent out is I didn't realize that they locked in a swap 4 years before the actual borrowing took place, if I'm understanding it. Is that correctly?
Yes, you're correct. So in 2005 is when we actually locked in the swap, with the thought that at that time interest rates were really low and we had to have certainty.
I understand the theory. I guess my question is, so swaps are very typical, traditional. I have absolutely no problem with a swap. You are in essence playing futures for the 4-year period, and you paid a price of some sort, I'm assuming, for that 4 years to be able to lock in for the 34 years for a 30-year financing?
Well, it was whatever the futures were pointing at that time for the 3-year period. And actually, as it turned out, in 2005, when we locked those rates, fast forward to 2008, rates were slightly higher at that time. But obviously, 2008, the financial market crisis happened and rates have fallen since then. So it wasn't, I think the article was saying that we were making a bet. We weren't making a bet.
I know you're not making a bet.
What we're trying to do is lock in the certainty
Yeah.
of the $600 million that we knew we were going to be spending.
I was just going to, okay. It's far more detailed issue.
Okay, well, maybe we can consider having that as part of the next meeting. Would the next meeting be when we have the quarterly financial review anyway, or not?
Yes, and
Well, maybe you could just expand that to.
we can expand that. In March, we basically kind of updated the board. It's not a new board members about the mechanics of a swap, why we did the swap. We'd certainly like to maybe bring that back and make that some other presentation.
Okay, great. Okay, any other?
Thank you. That's all.
Okay, for the consent agenda, we have those 2 items. Were there any questions or any further discussion on the consent agenda? Okay. Next on our agenda is the approval for the annual selection of chair and vice chair. I've had some discussions with Jose and Ariana on the question of whether we should push this to the end of the meeting or now, because the 3 of us spent, like a half an hour on the phone prepping me for this meeting. And so if what we do is vote somebody else in, they're kind of coming in blind. So if no one has a problem moving this towards
It
later.
would take effect immediately?
Well, we could also do a vote and have it not take effect until the next meeting.
Certainly should do that.
Okay, you want to do that?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so then it's open for discussion. Historic precedents suggest that the vice chair moves up to the chair, and then we kind of rotate the positions so that anybody who hasn't served would become the new vice chair unless anybody has particular compelling interests to do it differently.
I would raise an issue of whether there's any merit, instead of our traditional practice of having a 1-year term, to go to 2-year terms. The reason I argue there's a certain learning curve in any capacity, and it's not just sitting a stitch ahead of these meetings, it's what goes on behind the scenes and the effort that the church works with staff and such, and it just seems to me that to rotate that around every 1 year is needless extra work.
I would agree with that. Is there anything that prevents Stuart from staying or chair, vice chair staying?
Wait a second.
Chair, vice chair.
Now you're saying something.
Well, that would be my question is,
Or
what is
for
the...
Dustin to assume a 2-year term.
We're raising the principle, then we'll decide when we implement it, if it passes.
Wait a minute.
Well, currently the bylaws do specify 1 year, and the bylaws are subject to board approval as well. So we would just need to somehow make sure, we get the board to ratify that, I guess, somehow. I don't know if it could take effect this, as soon as this year, or if that is something that we can look at for the future, or maybe the vote contingent upon board approval, something along those lines.
If we're inclined to do it, I would suggest we make it contingent upon its end of your term.
That's what it says in the bylaws right now, yeah.
So
But
right
the amount
now-
of extra work that is required of the chair, is that something that individual wants to take on for 2 years? That would be my question. And if there is additional work, I don't necessarily know what the role of the chair is to understand.
I think the primary role of being the chair, and all of us have been chair, is simply to be able to run an effective meeting, period. You don't tell us what to do, we don't, you understand, it's like with any volunteer chair position. That I consider that the #1 qualification. I nominate Dustin to be the chair, to step in as chair. It's not fair to Stu to give him
I wasn't
2 years,
intending that.
a second year.
Yes, that's what we discussed.
Oh, I was gonna say, although Dustin seemed to have a different footing.
No.
I was doing a different path.
Well, but just to further
We
answer
can
Caitlin's.
negotiate. At any rate, I do not so nominate Dustin for our next chair.
I'll second that.
All right?
Just by way of discussion before we have that vote, just to further comment Caitlin's question, I guess my own experience is that the incremental time is that there are a minimum of 2, maybe 3 times that the ITOC presents to either the Transportation Committee or the full board. So there is that incremental time, which, you know, requires a little bit of preparation as well.
That is true. You've seen this annual report. It is the job of the chair to go before the full board of Sandag, which is every mayor in this county, and to report on what's in here as you see fit, or as you see fit, and that does take time to prepare for. But that comes at the end of the term.
Yeah, so that's, I think that pretty much says it all. Okay, so we have any other discussion?
I have a question on so doing the chair of the triennial audit. Any issues with doing both, or?
Oh, being the chair of the committee and
Yeah.
being the chair of the performance audit subcommittee at the same time.
No, I'm not. I just want to make sure that I'm not overextending or.
I think I was vice chair when I.
You were vice chair, okay.
Yeah.
I don't have an issue with it. Just want to make sure there's no.
Maybe a little extra work, but yeah, I think it's doable. We'll try to make it easy.
All right. Caitlin, will you accept the position as vice chair?
It comes as a surprise to me, and I definitely feel like I have not quite gotten a hold of exactly how this
understand fully.
committee runs, but I would prefer to do it next year, but if nobody else is willing to step up, then I can oblige.
Well,
I knew you
to ask
would.
Dick.
For 1 year. I think we're thinking of that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I know your travel schedule is a difficult one, but would you consider staying on, putting yourself up for the vice chair, recognizing that it's really just a, you know, more of a fill-in role than
I have no problem with that. I just don't want to be assumed that Elise is a chair. I might wind up being absent all the time.
Okay.
But I would encourage you to take it up.
Okay.
But,
Well,
Mr. Chair, we'll have the same problem the end of next year, though, when it comes time to appoint a chair. And if Dick can't do it, then you're gonna have to go around to the usual suspects again.
Unless he's chair for a second year.
And we would probably be
Unless
turning
he's in
into
chair for a second.
Yeah, that may be the case, I guess. Let's put it this way, I think she's politely suggested, well, I think her words were that she would prefer to do it next year, so personally, I would say in deference to her interest.
All right.
Let's do
And there is a solution here, if we are inclined to go to a 2-year deal. As Dustin goes for 2 years, I'm a 1-year vice chair, she's a 2nd-year vice chair.
we can do that too. Okay, so well, do we have to make a separate motion then to propose Dick as vice chair? along with-
We don't have to, we can wait till next year and just reappoint, if you're so inclined to appoint Dustin for a 2nd year's chair. There's nothing to propose.
Well, all right, let's start with, we have a motion
Okay.
we've discussed the nomination of Dustin as chair. Can we have a vote on that? All in favor?
Yes.
All right, so I'll nominate Dick as vice chair.
Second that.
Okay, any further discussion on that? Putting aside the 1-year, 2-year question. Okay, all in favor of? Okay.
Thank you, Dick.
No, consideration of the 1 term versus 2 term. Other thoughts?
Caitlin, you should know that it took me 4 years to figure out what all the acronyms were about. So please be aware, it's not just the procedures that are to be learned, and I still have to look them up occasionally.
If we're so inclined on a 2-year versus 1-year term, would it be feasible for us to express our desires to have the ability, but not the requirement, to do a 2-year term?
Yeah.
So
we
each
can
time,
write it.
if the board, if we were so inclined to request it, then the board can authorize that, and then we can each time have judgment.
Does an action even need to be made? Because next year, can't we just nominate Dustin again? There's nothing in the bylaws that would preclude us from doing that, right?
Well, yeah, so that's, I guess, a kind of a bylaw question. Is there any, I presume it's silent on the concept that the current chair can serve a successive term.
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
All right, so we have that ability as is. I knew that.
Anybody who has served before can serve again.
Okay. Okay, so we finished this business, and then we could consider further the question of second terms when we come to it next year, unless there's strong feelings to.
No objection.
Okay. All right, so then we can move on.
What have we taken a vote? Did we vote on Richard?
Yes, we did.
And that was a decision upon Stewart maintaining the chair for
Just for this
meeting, right?
meeting.
Yes.
Okay, and so then, so for the purposes of the remainder of this meeting, Chair Halpert will continue to chair, and Chair Fuller, that would take effect for the September meeting. Okay.
Okay. All right. Good job. So next, Ariana, if you would give us the update from the Transportation Committee and Board.
Yeah, just a couple items since your last meeting this time around. Transportation Committee recommended and the board approved having the ITALC performance auditor conduct the portion of the 10-year review that would look back at performance of the program to date. And this is going to streamline similar processes under both the 10-year review and the performance audit. And both of those efforts are currently underway. And then your chair presented the ITALC annual report at the June board meeting as well. And the final product is at your seats. So this is based on the input that we received from you at your last meeting.
Were there any, just a question, were there any comments from the board as far as just the last year about some of the issues that have been
There were really two comments. One was, I believe it was the mayor of Del Mar,
Yes.
who thanked us for trying to take more of an approach of thinking about making this digestible and more sort of readable and understandable for the taxpayers. Supervisor Roberts also made similar comments and asked if there was anything else that the board could do to support the ITALC in that vein of trying to make the vast amount of information that's produced something that's easier for the public to digest. And my comment was just that I think that's really the constant challenge for all of us, that there's just so much going on and so much information that we all have to just be mindful of doing whatever we can to perhaps focus on the most important issues and to try to just strive to make communication, as clear and digestible as possible and do more of it. So.
Good. No, and I think the last draft I had seen, the special notice that you had drafted and we looked at, ended up on sort of the backside. I think it was better on that side in the sense of talking about what we did in fiscal, and then talk about sort of the special regarding the forecast. What made sense to put it sort of in the back versus the front.
Yeah, personally, I think staff did a good job of coming up with some graphics that
Yeah.
were very much in line with that notion of trying to make things more understandable for the public. So.
Is it my understanding there's a very limited hard copy distribution, mainly is just on the website?
It's mainly on the website, that's
And
correct.
do we have any ability to track how many hits it gets? Does anybody read this?
Yes, we do, and we're looking into that so that we can, in fact, we have the same questions.
It's interesting to know all your hard work, whether anybody read it.
Yeah, I think the hard copy production is basically what you have in your hands.
That's what I thought.
Is there anything else, Ariana, from?
That's it from me.
Okay, so we have an approval item, which Mark Davis is here along with Lisa, relating to the agreed upon procedures for the audit.
Good morning. Okay, so we're at the beginning of our year of audit. This is always a year-long process for the transit compliance audits. We started by the ITAC selecting members for the subcommittee, who then reviewed the suggested changes to the agreed-upon procedures. From that point, we come here today to present these procedures to you with a recommendation, of course. And from that point, the auditors then perform the audit. You will see us come back with results in the form of the drafts in March. If there are certain types of non-compliance items, we present those at the same time. We then have to take them to the Transportation Committee and then the Board of Directors for approval. And there is a 60-day waiting period from the point that the ITAC presents results of these audits, which will be in March or in April, before the audits can then be issued. So issuance is at your June meeting. So there's our year. So today, I'm not going to say much more than that right now. I'm going to turn this over to our auditor, Mark Davis, with the firm of Davis Barr. We'll take you through the changes in the agreed-upon procedures for fiscal year 17. After that and discussion, will come back to me, and we have a recommendation that we ask that you vote.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Good morning. As Lisa had mentioned, the audit subcommittee had met virtually. Throughout the month of June, we shared proposed procedures, proposed procedural changes with the committee, got feedback from the committee over a couple different sets of reviews, and what you have before you today is the results of the subcommittee's review of those proposed changes. We have those in front of you as redline versions, so it's easy to see what those changes are from the prior year, and they're very minimal for this year. We'll just walk over what those changes were. As you recall, there's 5 separate sets of agreed-upon procedures, one for Caltrans, one for the cities and counties, one for ITAC, one for SANDAG, and one for the transit operators. Throughout all 5 sets of AUPs, the dates obviously are going to change for the new fiscal year. But the other changes to note that are in all of the AUPs, with the exception of the one for the ITAC, have to do with changing the procedures related to indirect cost. And we have taken out, we're recommending taking out the term cognizant agency and replacing that with federal or state. We're also removing that term from the glossary as well. Cognizant agency has different meanings for different types of agencies, and so we wanted to standardize it, just indicate that has that indirect cost plan been reviewed by a federal or state agency. We also added a sentence to all 4 sets of AUPs within the indirect cost section that's really a follow-on to a comment that came out of when we presented the draft reports to you last year, and wanting to know how much in indirect cost dollars were actually spent by those agencies that were charging indirect costs, and what % of Transnet dollars did that represent. So we memorialized that into a procedure here, and that will come back to you when we present the draft reports to you. In the actual ITAC summary report, there will be a new schedule that will be added to that summary report that will now, year in and year out, give you that information that you had requested. The only other change is in the cities and county AUPs, and it is really just memorializing something that we disclosed last year within the Schedule C, the RTCIP schedule. The ordinance allows for expenditures or commitments to be included, so we just added that language into the procedures to memorialize what we had disclosed to you last year in the report. Those aren't the only proposed changes this year, and I'm available for any questions you may have.
A question, and this became an issue with me when I read the next agenda item with the proposed overhead allocation policy. The policy is fairly explicit when it talks about an audit. An audit means very little unless you know the scope of an audit. But your procedures here talk about everything's copacetic, if there's been a federal, state, or a CPA doesn't, quote, audit. It doesn't establish what criteria for that audit, whereas this policy does. It refers to a specific, whatever it is.
Well, that proposal, though, doesn't take effect for this year's audit.
Pardon me?
That proposal does not take effect yet for this year's
I
audit.
understand. So my point is this sufficiently definitive in terms of what an audit is to be adequate in terms of your purposes of saying an audit was done? What kind of an audit?
Based upon the existing ordinance, the language in the ordinance, which is limited into its discussion of indirect costs, we were able to, over the years, able to glean out this procedure as far as related to indirect costs. From an auditor standpoint, if we see that an indirect cost rate has been audited, we would expect to see an audit report related to that indirect cost. So we understand what that means. It's standard term, I guess, within the profession.
You're in essence going a step further, passing judgment on the quality of the audit, that it really addressed the right things. That's distinct from giving it a free pass just because you saw the word audit.
No, the existing ordinance doesn't talk about what the quality of the audit would be or not. All we're going to do is report back to you, did some external agency look at their indirect cost rate or their methodology, whether it be at the federal or state level, or if not, did they hire an independent CPA firm to do that? We won't be passing judgment onto the quality of that audit.
Well, didn't we last year or the year before also add a reasonableness comment to this process as well, so that in addition to auditing whether yes or no there was a federal, state agency or outside audit that reviewed the procedure, but that your firm itself would also comment on whether it was reasonable?
Yes, that's correct. The last sentence in the in that does indicate that if the indirect cost plan was not reviewed by the feds or the states or as independent CPA firm, then we would look at the reasonableness. We wouldn't audit it, but we would just look at reasonableness.
Doesn't look at the reasonableness of the federal or state, but it does.
Assuming we pass this, the next agenda item, then for the following year, it'll be well documented what the audit is supposed to address. Right? Okay. I'll wait till next year.
As vice chair.
As vice chair. As vice chair.
Are there anything else? Because this is an approval item. Okay. I'll move to approve the changes as described. Okay. Discussion? All in favor? Okay. So you guys stick around for our next item, which is the proposed indirect cost allocation policy.
During the discussion of the fiscal year 16 Transnet audit reports in March, the ITAC requested that SANDAC staff prepare standardized guidelines for application of indirect costs. So we're here today to present the proposed guidelines, which are the culmination of discussions with the auditor, with various parties here at SANDAG, and researching the topic. The proposed guidelines follow current federal regulations with just a few modifications. One area we discussed was whether indirect costs are allowed for the ordinance. And so there is nothing specific in the ordinance to either direct or indirect costs. It's better to look at the intent of the language overall, which is to cover costs of Transnet projects for the various programs. Total cost of the project includes both direct and indirect costs. So direct costs are those which sometimes by the ITAC are referred to as bricks and mortar. That would be like direct labor of employees or contractors performing street overlay, or the cost of the material needed to build a freeway route. These costs are easily identified as those of a specific project. Now, indirect costs are the expenses of doing business that are not easily identified for a specific project or a program, such as shared administrative costs, finance, human resources, technology, along those lines. So that's just some general information I wanted to pass on, and now I'd like to mention what we've provided in today's packet. So So your attachment 1 includes the proposed guidelines. Attachment 2, that's the pros and cons of not just the language included in the proposed guidelines, but also we're looking at factors that have been excluded. Attachment 3 is a listing of the jurisdictions that charged an indirect rate to their transnet projects in fiscal year 16, including the ratio of indirect costs to total transnet costs. And also we've included when their last indirect plan was updated. And this is the information that Mark just mentioned in the last item. It was requested by the ITAC in March, so that's your attachment 3. The proposed guidelines were also presented to the CTAC, the Cities and County Transportation Advisory Committee, last week. And while there were a few comments at that meeting, I've since communicated with a few jurisdictions, and I'll provide these comments during the discussion phase of today's presentation. At the end of the discussion, I'd like to go over the next steps to close out the report. So at this time, I will pass it over to Mark once again, and he will go over the proposed guidelines.
Okay, we're just going to walk through briefly the proposed rule and those guidelines related to indirect cost allocation plans. And this has really come about because over the last 2 to 3 years that we've been doing these, more and more discussion at your meetings related to the audit reports has all focused on indirect cost. So the proposed guidelines would include 7 areas. The first 4 really have to do with what we talked about on external types of audit reports related to indirect cost allocation plans. The first being that just as we have in the existing procedure, that the plan has been reviewed or approved by a state or federal agency. When those plans are submitted to state or federal agency for review and approval, those states and fed agencies will go through in depth, make sure they're all in accordance with applicable guidelines for their needs for an indirect cost allocation plan, and then we'll generally provide an approval letter back to the agency that the plan's in accordance with whatever guidelines they were submitted for. The second option, so that would be one option to have indirect costs allocated. The second way would be that if a recipient agency gives they don't submit it to a state or federal agency, but they give their indirect cost allocation plan to a CPA firm and have that CPA firm perform procedures or audit the plan, and to ensure that it is prepared in accordance with the cost principles that are outlined in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title II, Part 200, Subpart E. It's a lot of words there, but the cities and counties or government agencies had to, in years past, prepare their cost allocation plans if they were going to get federal awards in accordance with an Office of Management and Budget Circular, OMB Circular A87. At the end of 2015, that circular was, in essence, superseded by this new CFR section, Part 200. All those items with a little bit of tweaking was moved into this this new, what they call super circular or uniform guidance. So that's the first 2 ways. The third way would be if the agency has their management approval by submitting the cost allocation plan to their governing body, have their governing body in essence adopt that cost allocation plan each year through a resolution or some other form that the agency normally adopts those types of items, and that and indicating that also that it's prepared in accordance with the Code of Federal Regulations. So all 3 of those, an agency could have their plan adopted in one of those 3 fashions. In addition to that, we would ask that the indirect cost methodology be updated at least every 2 years. Now there is some guidance by the Government Finance Officers Association that indicates that best practice would be to update that no more than every 3 years, but if there's triggering events that occur, it should be updated more frequently than that. Some of those triggering events would be if the the agency changes its organizational structure, changes its fund structure, so it changes things that would drive how costs are going to be allocated. That's a triggering event, and the plan should be updated more frequently than once every 3 years. We're recommending it once every 2 years. If the next guideline then would be if a plan or if an agency does not update that cost allocation plan within those last two fiscal years, and they could come to you for a request for a 1-year extension, and that would be up to your considerations. If an agency next guideline, if an agency has not updated their plan in accordance with all of these previous guidelines, then they would be prohibited from charging indirect costs to the Transnet program until such time as they're in compliance with these guidelines. And then finally, the last guideline is just that the indirect cost plan will be included as a procedure as part of your annual agreed upon procedures each year. Those are the proposed guidelines that we'd be recommending. Available for any questions you may have. We'd be recommending today.
So I read this as A or B and then C through G, or is it A or B or C and then D through G?
The latter. A or B or C and everything
Oh,
else.
I missed the last word.
Just for clarity, you said the words which I think are appropriate, but they're different than what are written here. There's a subtle difference between B and C. B talks in accordance with, and the other says follows closely. Unless you intended there to be a distinction between those two, I would suggest you use exactly the same word. You did when you verbally stated it. See what I'm talking about?
The, I guess a change could be,
Yep,
could be
absolutely.
made.
I guess a question and a comment. The first question would be with regard to that situation where an entity has not complied with the guidelines and therefore is not able to charge indirect costs until such time as they do. At the time that they do, they then get to retroactively apply the. You
have a role in government service.
Do they or do they not have the ability to then retroactively, in effect, kind of reimburse themselves for the indirect costs during the period when they were not allowed to do that allocation? Or has that not been contemplated, or does my question not make any sense?
We haven't really talked about that,
Yeah.
but I can give you my opinion if you, if you. Usually when the cost allocation plans are prepared, they are prospective plans. And so applying something on a retroactive basis that is prepared for a prospective process doesn't make sense to me. For example, when a cost allocation plan is prepared, you're looking at the organizational structure at that point going forward. And so if the organizational structure was different, let's say in the years that the agency was not able to charge indirect costs to the Transnet program, if you allowed a retroactive application of that, it could result in an unfair and unequitable allocation of costs to the Transnet program.
Gotcha, okay, thanks. And so then the comment I had is, I don't know if folks have had a chance to look at the table that shows the actual numbers there.
The actual numbers for last year.
Yeah, I guess the absence of any kind of cap was a curiosity to me. In particular, there's, I think, the city of Chula Vista, which is a real outlier. And so I just wanted to put on the table the issue of contemplation of a cap, whether that was ever discussed, or and why not, if not, if it was, why it was not adopted, why the concept was not adopted.
The rates that are provided in the attachment represent the actual percent of dollars that were allocated to the Transnet program doesn't necessarily represent the indirect cost rate that the plan had approved. So for example, in Chula Vista's case, their total indirect cost rate is 86% of labor, fringe, overhead, and maintenance costs. So 86% of those costs could be allocated to programs, but there may not be those types of costs that would receive those allocations within the Transnet program. Therefore, only 13% gets allocated to the program, because there's less labor dollars that are being charged to the Transnet program, if that makes sense.
That did not make sense to me.
It gets to the issue of a cap, and I would be intuitively very supportive of a cap. However, overhead accounting is so complex, and there's such a great variety of what one considers to be direct and indirect. I think your example, oversimplified, you have two different rates, one for labor and one for materials. In manufacturing, we do that. So you might have a 50% overhead rate and a 10% overhead rate here for a blended 45, but if a project has a distinct difference between labor and overhead, you're going to get a different rate than your expected 45%. So the idea of a cap would be very, very difficult to enforce.
That's correct. The indirect cost plans are definitely more art than science in preparation of them.
But a classic example is a project manager. Some people will charge it direct, some people will put it in overhead. The office for the project manager, is that indirect or direct? It'll differ by anybody's individual cost accounting plan. So,
yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Yet at the same time, I think there are certain things that are typically associated with indirect costs, which I think one would want to have capped, right? Like sort of, you know, similar to in Sandag's case, there's that, is it a 1% cap on allocation of admin costs? Right. I mean, something that is a pure admin cost, you know, in theory, you don't want, you know, half of an entity's administrative costs being charged to Transnet dollars, right? I mean, directionally. So that, I realize it may not be a simple thing, but it just struck me that some concept of a cap would seem appropriate.
this gets to the heart of how we had this original discussion of getting some visibility on do the entities charge overhead. I don't know how many years ago it was, but I had raised a question. But back when the cities were really struggling with their budget, there was a
Right.
possible intention to
Yeah,
do
that's
just
right,
what
that you
you're
use
saying.
Transnet dollars to fill in the budgetary holes.
Exactly. But the theory of having an approved overhead allocation process, I'm assuming precludes the idea that they would inordinately load up Transnet versus their own city projects, because there would have to be a universally uniform overhead allocation process.
Right, that's correct. When a cost allocation plan is prepared in accordance with the cost principles in the federal guidelines, it has to result, you have to include everything in the cost plan. You can't exclude things from the cost plan in order to come up with that fair and equitable allocation. Once that plan's prepared, doesn't mean that agencies have to charge what that plan says to anything. It can be anywhere below that amount. That amount, when the plan's prepared, represents the ceiling that results in a fair and equitable allocation.
So conceivably, they could have a very high ceiling and only charge Transnet projects that ceiling, and all their internal projects they can charge half of that ceiling and get to the concern that Stuart has.
I am generally against non-simple governmental regulations, whatever they refer to. On our annual Transnet audits, will we be getting a report on what the overhead numbers are for each organization?
Yeah.
Wouldn't we be within our rights then to look at that and ask a member agency to explain if they come in with 29.47%? And then decide at that point if we wish to do anything about it or chastise them or report it or what have you.
I presume we have, but then their answer would be we're just complying with the.
Well, we do have regulations now, or we will have, I presume, as spelled out here. I'm just generally against us probably
It is interesting.
regulation.
It is interesting to note. I mean, if you're another one of these cities that has such a low percent, and you see that Chula Vista's got 30%, why not the next time around? I mean,
Yeah, could we clarify that again? So the rates that you're looking at here are not the cost allocation rates, right? That would be a different rate. That rate is then applied to only certain types of costs. So what you're looking at here, you're seeing what the total Transnet costs for the year were, and then the amount of indirect that was charged against that based on whatever the rate is. That's what the ratio, that's what you're seeing, that 29%. Now, in certain years, some of the jurisdictions will have, this rate will be high because perhaps they're performing the work in-house. They're not contracting out. So you're going to have these indirect costs, and because it is part of the cost of a project. So that would make sense. Whereas others that are contracting out more often may not have some of those costs.
I have a fundamental question that if we're coming up with an indirect cost rate, are we not saying that we're applying that rate to every jurisdiction? So what's the rate that we're coming up with? Each jurisdiction is allowed to determine its own rate?
Yes.
Yes, correct.
And that can be, you're saying there should be a cap, or it could be anything
Well,
you
I'm just
want.
raising the question.
Right.
It seems like there are certain things that you would want capped.
It appears to me that if they don't spend their entire allocation in 1 year, but they're planning ahead for it in the
Right,
next year.
that's understandable.
Their overhead rate could be higher.
Yeah, and I would argue that just hypothetically, if there were some sort of a cap, then that would be the situation where they come and say, hey, look, for this reason, we need to be excused from.
Well, I don't like regulations if we can help it.
You know, and part of, when this plan was discussed and decided that the best course would be to follow something that's already out there, right? It's the federal regulations, it's kind of the standard right now, this PCFR. We wanted to keep that intact as much as possible. They don't have a cap. And while I'm not discounting that, I would like to say, you know, put some caution out there and say that this is something that we would want to have additional conversations that look into this, because we don't know what this effect would be on other programs, non-Transnet of these jurisdictions. It could have a great impact. We just don't know at this point. So if this is a direction that the ITOC is thinking that they would like to go, we could definitely have that conversation and bring results back, perhaps, you know, modify the guidelines or let you know that here's where we're seeing a problem with going in that direction.
I wouldn't think that we need something stricter than a federal guideline along Jonathan's line of thinking, would be my own opinion. But
The idea of the cap, I think, is very well intended, but we would all have to start wearing green eye shades before we've thoroughly understood the issues. I mean, you got the simplistic thing, what I call a direct indirect and pure indirects. If you have labor working on a project, the fringe benefits are going to be, most accounting systems, they call that an indirect cost. Then you have the mayor's salary. That's really indirect. Those are two entirely different things, but they'll all get buried into an overhead allocation thing. Our concern would be the mayor's salary getting allocated projects versus the holiday pay and fringe benefits of a worker working on the project. Two entirely different things.
Well, so a little bit of my thought process is, again, using the analogy of the Sandex, cap on. Is it a 1%? Or what
It
was
is.
the-
It is a 1%
The 1%.
on that.
Okay. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my thought process is that putting aside one's philosophical belief about regulations, loose or tight, that was something viewed to be helpful in having the original measure be approved by the voters, right? And so that philosophy that this is conceptually something that taxpayers want to see is part of what drives my question. I realize that there may be a lot of complications behind it, but I guess I would just suggest that perhaps it be something to be considered or thought a little bit more about.
Do we have a better understanding of what this 1% cap is? It's embedded in Sandag's regulations. What is being addressed in that cap?
You're talking about the administration,
I don't
or
know.
administrative?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, right, so, and that would be, I actually printed that page out.
Of the ordinance, section 12?
Is that section 12? Okay, yeah, it's,
Yeah, because that's really what triggered my thought
Yeah.
process about this, is that there's some precedent.
right, that, what it states is that costs for general transit fund administration and transportation planning are eligible up to 1% of annual revenues. And right now, the only agency that does that is the City of San Diego. That would actually have to be in the RTIP as 1%. And so the way that works is they would have a project number set up in their system that individuals who work a big chunk of their time, maybe not specifically on a project, but doing the oversight of the program, such as the accountant, all the audit time that they put in, or an analyst in the transportation department who handles the RTIP and other factors. That's not a project, but it's a transnet. On their side, it's a transnet project. They charge to that directly. That would be similar to myself. We have here at Sandag, we have a transnet project number, and today I'm charging my time right now to transnet. Now that falls under our admin. It's a little bit different, but it's the same concept that, you know, I'm covered by transnet. Even though I'm in the finance department, I am not necessarily an indirect. However, our accounts payable, accounts receivable staff who perform work for all of Sandag, they are part of the indirect. So that's the difference with the 1%.
Well, I probably follow along the lines of what Sean and Caitlin. I mean, I feel like if I'm understanding right, so they're doing their indirect cost rate audits under guidelines, regulations that guide how to do them. An individual city, like a smaller city or something, their actual percentage, like show them in the chart thing, could be, well, whether they do something in-house, something like you said, in a given year, or a phase of a project that they're in. You know, that if a bigger agency like San Diego Caltrans has so much going on that it's going to probably normalize year by year, be kind of consistent. But in a smaller city, we're going to see these big fluctuations year by year, and as long as they're following the guidelines and they're based on their allowable indirect cost rates based on their audit, I'm comfortable with that.
And also, I would like, one of the comments that I received from the jurisdictions, the City of Chula Vista, when we sent this material out to all of the jurisdictions, they came back and said, oh, but we have updated our plan. And so attachment 3 shows that the last update was fiscal year 12. And that could be part of the reason. It might just be very stale. And there may have been, as Mark mentioned, maybe some organizational changes that could have adjusted the rate since that time. But they do have a new rate that was prepared during fiscal year 17. And that was also a comment of the ITALC in March, or in June, excuse me, when we presented the final reports. So that's good news there.
So any of these that haven't been updated in the last 2 years, if this is something we're looking to adopt, the new 7 things, is that correct? So they wouldn't be able to be anywhere less than or more than 2 years behind on their update, correct? So
right.
The first, these other cities that are fiscal year 13, 12, et cetera, they need to update theirs.
Correct, right. So the 12 has, I think, was that the only 12? Yeah, that one has been updated. And the way, so we were actually discussing the timing of how that works. So for the fiscal year 17 transit compliance audits, we're just starting that phase right now. It's performed during fiscal year 18, but the plan has to be in place prior to 17 in order for them to then use those rates. And it would have been, we decided FY14?
Yeah, more than likely, the plan would have been developed the year prior, 15-16, to be used in 16-17. And if it was developed in 15-16, it would need to be based on the most recent closed fiscal year, which, depending upon the time of year the plan was developed, could either be 14-15 or 13-14.
So it could automatically be a 2-year no matter what. But the 3-year could also fall into place with that. So yeah, but you are correct that for the fiscal year 13, that most likely would have to be updated. And that would be something that we would reach out. However, another point here is that this would go into effect if we eventually get through the board process for fiscal year 19. It has to be in place prior to the budgetary process, and budget starts sometimes in December, but typically January for the following fiscal year. So we would want it in place hopefully by November, so they could use it as part of their fiscal year 19 budgetary process, which is prepared during the second half of fiscal year 18. I hope that made sense. I should have had a chart, but but it does work. And I have discussed that with a couple of the jurisdictions, and once I pointed out fiscal year 19, everybody, it was great relief on that because we understood the budgetary process.
So I'm also sympathetic to the issue of regulatory burden, if you will. And so on that point, could you maybe just fill us in a little bit as to the thinking on the 2 years as opposed to the 3 years? Because I'd be curious as to your thought process on choosing to recommend the 2 years.
The 2 years is generally on that look back period that the federal guidelines say you should prepare it on your most for the upcoming prospective year that you're submitting it for. You should use your most recently completed final numbers, fiscal year numbers, to prepare that. So again, just looking at this, if we were talking using it for the 16-17 fiscal year, that plan was probably prepared in the 15-16 fiscal year, and to prepare that plan, an agency would have had to use their 14-15 actual numbers because that's their most recently completed year at the time the plan was prepared. So hence the 2 years from 17 back to 15.
No, sorry, I'm talking about the requirement that the plan be updated.
Yeah, that would be.
Because I guess I'm not seeing why that doesn't also
follows the same guidelines on any cost allocation plan in accordance with the federal guidelines. Whenever a plan gets submitted, and generally you will be submitting these plans on an annual basis. Doesn't mean the feds or the state are going to approve them that quickly, and that doesn't happen. But you'd be submitting them on an annual basis. You're always rolling forward your most recently completed fiscal year to prepare your new plan and submit it.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Any other questions or thoughts?
And if I could, there were some comments that we received from some of the local jurisdictions. I would like to provide those to you. But the first I already provided. The city of Chula Vista has updated their indirect cost allocation plan. We have the city of El Cajon. They have 2 items that they pointed out. One is they are suggesting that kind of the opposite of what you were discussing, having a de minimis rate of 10%. And they did quote where that is located in the guidelines. And I don't know, do you want to have a brief discussion on that? The merits?
Just for clarification, by de minimis rate, you mean a no less than?
A no less than. No,
Greater than.
it would be,
Like
you can choose that in lieu of
Oh, I see. Okay.
preparing a plan. I'm just going to use 10%. I'm not gonna bother putting it together, even if we're, if one of the jurisdictions does not charge indirect to a federal or state grant, then they may not have need to prepare a plan, and it could be costly, even if they go through item C of the our proposed guidelines, which is to have management and then the governing body approve it. It's still, there's a cost factor to that.
Sure.
So they may say, well, we don't want to bother with that at all. We're just going to take the 10%. So then there's the reasonableness piece to that.
I think if the de minimis piece was put in, well, let me back up. I believe in the federal guidelines, it doesn't really talk about a 10% de minimis. Where that really we see come in is in individual grant programs that agencies may be using. That grant-specific programs may say you could have this de minimis rate, whatever that may be, and 10% seems to be very common. I think what you would see if you implemented a de minimis rate is there's more jurisdictions that are not charging indirect costs now than are. You'll see every jurisdiction charge indirect cost, and you won't see the bricks and mortar, if you will, of the program being put on the street.
This is all totally dependent on one's definition of indirect cost. A classic indirect cost are fringe benefits being applied to labor as a percentage basis of charge. Clearly, those are getting charged in your lexicon direct here, because if someone's talking about de minimis 10%, it doesn't even cover the benefit cost of all the employees that are charging direct. So the whole essence of getting into a real quagmire in terms of trying to get some comparability across multiple different agencies. They're all going to have different philosophical approaches to what they call what. I'm very sympathetic to the concern of taking pure administrative effort in the city, mayor or staff and such, and trying to charge our projects, but trying to develop a control and having to manage that across all these different entities is extremely difficult.
And the whole idea on indirect cost is really, going now from an agency's perspective, is really to be able to present the absolute full cost of a given project or a given cost objective. And to do that, agencies prepare indirect cost plans to be able to determine what that full cost of that project was. So that's why it's good from an agency perspective, but again, from maybe the taxpayer perspective, that full cost of that project won't necessarily be your bricks and mortars that you're going to see out in the field.
I took a little concern about the terminology of bricks and mortar. You've mentioned it several times. That's on your little matrix here, the advantages and disadvantages. I don't know what use would be made of this document, but if it gets in the hands of the public, the idea that taxpayers are not receiving benefit of bricks and mortars for 100% of your sales dollars. It's a question of what an indirect cost is. If it's a fringe benefit, it's an absolute necessary cost, and you are getting benefit. If it's the cost of the rent, or all the people who do the project sit in that rent building, it's typically considered an overhead item, but it's very much a necessary part of the project. It's bricks and mortar. That's an overly simplistic idea of what is and is not.
Okay, I'm going to call you on this, Dick. So the reason I put that in there was at our June meeting, I almost quoted you verbatim.
You should never do that.
I thought, well, Dick said it, so I'm going to put it in there. If that was a concern, I wanted to put in something that may, it came up with the ITALC as a concern.
I don't know whether I was awake at that point in time, what I was saying. I think it'll cause more concern of people not understanding what's an indirect and direct cost.
Okay.
And we also had, if I can move to another comment?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I mentioned this one. At the CTAC meeting, the city of Escondido, they suggested that we go with a 3-year term instead of a 2-year term, as we're suggesting in the guidelines. And we have discussed that a little bit. I wanted to bring that up since it was suggested.
Granted them the ability to go 3 years anyway.
They do, absolutely.
Right.
And if, we did just discuss that before we came up here this morning, and the thought was, the ITAC decided that, let's just go with the 3-year. We would remove that 1-year extension, because that is the 3rd year. We just say, well, just make it 3 years and remove that one, and then that's it.
Well, just for clarity, my understanding is that this is not an ITALC approval.
Correct. However, we are taking suggestions for changes and to go back and, you know, work out some of the language a little bit more.
I'm not opposed to allowing 3 years if they're already kind of, that seems to be available to them now and to lessen the administrative burden, but I don't know. I didn't fully understand
The timing.
2-year thing, so I don't know. You seem to be
So
questioning.
Escondido was the only entity that came back with
I
2
believe
versus
they were
3.
I believe they were the only one that came back with the 3-year. Yeah. Yeah, I think they were the only ones with the 3-year.
I support the 2-year with their option to come in and ask for 5 years.
Okay.
So would you like the 2-year with the 1-year extension? Going with that, okay, so we'll do that. And I'm Scott. So we also have with us today Scott Clark, is Deputy Director of the City of San Diego Comptroller's Office. We talked on the phone quite a bit last Thursday or Friday morning, something. And I suggested that he come today to say his piece.
Okay.
Here we go.
Well, good morning, committee members. My name is Scott Clark. I'm a Deputy Director with the Office of the City Comptroller in the City of San Diego. And my purpose really here is just to kind of continue the discussion and acknowledge and respectfully request of the committee members that our organization still have a little bit more time to kind of review and analyze some of the impacts of this proposal. So we want to be able to give some constructive and some meaningful feedback now back to Lisa and then her team too, so they can be part of the decision making going into this process. As a large organization, we want to make sure that we can completely vet and understand and be able to implement any of the impacts of what this proposal would be going forward. So healthy discussion in here. It is a very complex discussion, a very complex process going through the indirect cost rates. And Mr. Vorman, I have some of those green eye shades if you'd like to kind of help go over some of this. But that's really it. Just want to be able to acknowledge and let the group know that we want to be able to give some constructive feedback in a meaningful manner going forward for the committee considerations. So, thank you.
And we've had 2 other agencies that have requested the same. And what I would ask of the ITAC is that we come back in September with some compiled comments from the jurisdictions and then take up the conversation at that time.
Is that adequate time that you're seeking?
Yes, it is.
And so is all the time that the entities put into that review considered indirect costs then?
Oh, that's direct charge.
I have a couple other questions, sorry. Is there currently no methodology for indirect costs? Is that why you guys initially brought this up? Or have they been required to follow the federal guideline on this? Has there been anything in place to date?
Yeah, no, the ordinance does not, and our board policy, we do not have anything in place that has very specific requirements. This is how it must be followed. What we've discussed with the jurisdictions, those have come forward and asked if they could charge an indirect. We have said, well, if you have a plan in place, then use those rates. And I think that where, especially having this additional time is really needed is not all of the jurisdictions that have a rate use it for a federal or a state grant reimbursement or indirect reimbursement. They might have a software program, or they might just have a consultant prepare it for them for internal use. And so it may not really follow these guidelines. They might have their own method of setting it up. And as long as it's been reasonable, that's what the auditor has been looking for.
Okay. Second question is more regarding transit in general, and I apologize if I didn't catch this in our briefing, but when they're compiling all these costs for transit funds, do they already have, did the jurisdictions come up with their own budget to then request to SANDAG this is the total amount of money I need for Transnet? Or is it they are awarded a certain amount of money and then they allocate that money to the different costs?
So the ordinance does tell us how much of the annual funds are allocated for the different programs. So and we'll discuss the street and road, the local street improvement, which is for the cities and the county. So within that, there's a breakdown in there, and it tells us how to determine the allocation method for each of the jurisdictions. So every month that we receive the sales tax, we allocate funds for each of these local jurisdictions for the local street and roads. It's split between their congestion relief and their maintenance. Those are the two within that program. And in order for them to receive these allocations, we hold them. They have to go through, on their side, they have a budgetary process, but they also have to go through their RTIP process. They have to put it into, and we have a couple of amendments, so they'll, Sue will be discussing some of these, but they would have to go through that whole process to say, here are my projects and here are the different types of funds that I'm going to use. One of those would be Transnet, and it would identify the type of Transnet. There could be the grants, there could be the street and road, there could be the major corridor, just whichever of the programs they have it.
And then further, is it broken out into direct, indirect, everywhere?
No, it's a pot of money. In fact, when we receive interest on the investments, it just becomes Transnet.
Okay, so it's to the city's benefit, if you will. It could be looked at both ways, but if they want to maximize the bricks and mortar dollars, they use the lowest indirect rate and figure out how that's used. So I guess I'm just trying to understand what would be the benefit to a city of charging 30% versus 5%, because
that is what gave rise to this entire discussion several years ago. There was no prescribed limits or methodology for it, and there was very little visibility. And back then, when the fiscal crisis was going on, there was an incentive, potential incentive, for cities to offload their overhead and use the Transnet dollars to pay for, I'm making the extreme case, no offense, to pay for the mayor's office through an overhead charge. It was quite the reverse.
And on top of that, some jurisdictions were not actually fully spending the dollars. So to your point, it's not as if there were so many projects begging for the dollars that your logic makes sense, but rather the dollars that were allocated haven't been fully spent. So that's part of it as well.
thank you.
All right.
So the plan then would be for SANDAG to then work with the local jurisdictions. We'll notify all of them that we're providing additional time for their comments. We'll compile that, bring it back to you in September. We'll review the plan again. The formal process, if it's decided to that we definitely want to go forward and include this in our board policy 31, which is our Transnet board policy, the formal process is with our general counsel. He would include this as part of his annual board policy update, which could be anywhere from October to December. It just depends on when it gets in the calendar. And if there are changes to board policy 31, the Transnet, it always comes to ITOC, my understanding?
Yes,
Yes, it does. It comes to ITOC. And we go to the Transportation Committee and then ultimately the Board of Directors, who would hopefully approve whatever we bring forward at that time. So there is still some time to work through this.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay. Next is an information item, Alex, to talk about the local city road government status report.
Hello, Alex Estrella, and the item before you is the fourth Transit Local Streets and Road Program Annual Report that staff put together with the input from the Cities and County Transportation Advisory Committee. With me is Ed Dean, who's our CTAC chair. He's also the Deputy City Engineer for the City of San Marcos. So I'm just going to provide a brief presentation on the attachment included here for item number 9, walk you through the sections, and then really open up for any questions that you might have on the projects, on the process. If there are any specific questions to individual agencies, what we could do is go back to those individual agencies and get some answers for you, or have them come in if we try talk meetings to provide more detail. So with that, in terms of just a high-level kind of background and review, really the basis for the report is part of the, if you recall, at the FY 2012 Transit Triangle Performance Audit Report recommendations, specifically 3 to 6, which really focuses on having SANDAG take a greater role in monitoring the program. And if you recall, so back in 2013, we worked with CTAC at that point, along with ITOC and with your guidance, and developed a template that's really included here in attachment 1 for the local agencies to submit. So let me just walk you through, for example, the first agency, which I believe is page number 2 of the attachment, which is the City of Carlsbad. So the level of information that's provided for the local streets and road program or projects really focuses on 3 sections. They're all in narrative form, and the idea behind section number A really focuses on providing a highlight of completed efforts under the program for that corresponding reporting period. In this case would be the FY 2016. So for example, if you're looking at page number 2, the project that I like to highlight is the City of Carlsbad CV 4A, which is project number 1, where they've indicated and noted that just over $1.8 million was used to complete their Camino Real winding project from Tamarack to Chestnut Avenue. Another highlighted project, so for example, part of the local streets and road program can be used for roadway maintenance. They've highlighted project number 4, CV2, which they've indicated they spent just $1.2 million to repave approximately 7 miles of pavement overlays. Following on section number B, again in narrative form, but essentially focused on specifically or noting the projects completed for that reporting period, and they've highlighted, again, part of their ongoing maintenance effort. They've highlighted that they completed their payment overlay program for that specific year, project number 2, but they've also included that they completed the Carlsbad Boulevard Bridge, was probably highlighted in the previous report. And then let's follow through page number 3, section number 3. The idea here is to list what they anticipate undertaking over the next fiscal year, and as you can see, it's a list of projects, and they include and range from major capital improvement projects, like they highlighted the Carlsbad Bridge over the Senior Power Station discharge channel, but they've also included other related projects, or some of the projects that anticipate on completion, which would be FY17, and obviously that would be reported in this next fiscal year. The following sections, the template concludes with the following sections, essentially trying to highlight, and this is something that came about from the previous recommendation that we made to ITOC, whether we want to highlight any noted issues or challenges with the local streets and road program balances, or if they want to highlight any other comments for the program. And one thing that I would like to highlight in previous local streets and road program annual reports, one of the things is being cognizant of the local roadway program balances. And in fact, for this particular issue, none of the agencies highlighted that they weren't able to meet their 75% threshold that was established by ITOC. So no issues here. In fact, I think that was reported, part of the quarterly progress report in March, that none of the agents had issues with 75% monitoring threshold. The other thing too, that for the agencies that did submit comments or notes on that last section, really was City of Oceanside and City of Encinitas and City of San Marcos. It's essentially highlighted the importance of the program, or the level of funding that's provided through the program to meet sort of the anticipated project completions from a larger project. That was sort of the narrative, so that's the theme, at least for those that submitted comments to that. But anyway, this item is presented for information. And again, if you guys have any questions on the process, Ed and I will be happy to answer any questions, but if you have any specific questions to any of the templates submitted by the local agencies, we can go back and ask those agencies and submit responses or have them present at a future ITOM meeting. That concludes our presentation. Happy to answer any questions. That concludes our presentation.
Thank you. First of all, I'll be brief, and I'd like to be complimentary also. I've been on this committee for 6 years, and we've been looking for something like this the entire time, because we were looking for more transparency and indications of future planning and how good the planning was for the use of our 30% local streets and roads money that was allocated to the member agencies. CTAC, were you folks formed before we started beating on you? Did you have a CTAC?
Yes, we have.
Okay, very good. Well, CTAC, of course, is an organization of all the city engineers and their representatives planning for how to do the job better and what should they do. And they came up with this finally. I even met with one of their meetings and we discussed it. And they came up with this annual report that shows what work they've completed using Transnet money and what work is planned for the years ahead, or for the next year at least. And I sort of sneaked and cheated, and last year the city of San Diego, who has been our bad boy for a while, for many reasons, I compared their future projects with the RTIP and found that they had some future projects that were not listed on the RTIP, and there were projects on the RTIP that were indicated to be spending money on, and they weren't doing anything. And they came right back and said, hey, thank you, we hadn't thought of that, we did, and so I just want you to know, I have just spot checked this from the city of San Diego, and I found that they're consistent now, that the projects are consistent with the RTIP. And I think this is excellent, and we don't nitpick it, that's your business, but I'm so pleased to see the city of San Diego is doing better. And I did see the city of Oceanside's comment that 30% is not enough money to do the job properly, but I think we're bound on that one. So
Yeah.
that's my entire comment.
I have one question, the 70-30, and I guess that's one of the audit elements to see whether the agencies are complying. But what's the definitional? What is the definition of 30 and 70? I just read through some of these, and there's a lot of different words that are used, and some of them explicitly say it's for congestion relief. Others say it's for maintenance. Others say it's for rehabilitation.
Right.
Which camp does rehabilitation fall in?
Don't have the exact word, but basically there's 70%.
I have the exact word. It says at least 7% of the revenues provided for local streets and road purposes should be used to fund direct expenditures for construction of new expanding facilities. And then it goes on with it. For no more than 30% of these funds should be used for local streets and road maintenance purposes. The local agencies desire to spend more than 30% of its annual revenue for maintenance related to projects, so provide justification to the commission. And I think from a maintenance standpoint, from an overlay standpoint, roadway rehabilitation, it's any treatment that's an overlay less than an inch or less. So if you did a slurry seal, if you did a chip seal, a cape seal, any of those type of preventative maintenance programs, that would be your preventative maintenance or maintenance program. Striping similar to that. For rehabilitation, it'd be any overlay thicker than that, or full construction.
This is the construction of the Voltaire Street Bridge over Nimitz Boulevard, quote, dash rehabilitation project. Is that a replacement of a bridge?
It could be a bridge deck rehabilitation, probably could be a sidewalk.
Well, using that as an example, a replacement of a bridge. There's always been a bridge there, it's falling apart, we replace it. Is that maintenance or is that congestion relief? Is that 70 or 30?
That'd be your 70.
It's only $1 million.
That would be your that would be reconstruction. From a municipal standpoint.
Yeah, I was going to say that's why I'm raising the question.
And there's also a more detailed listing of the specific guidance in the ordinance, right? That shows the 70% type of projects versus the 30% type of projects.
Are these all supposed to be the 30%?
Pardon me?
Are these all supposed to fall under the 30%?
No. They're everything, but the requirement is you can't outspend any more over the long term, over the 30%. The idea is just, once again, if you're suspicious of cities that use their money elsewhere and they'll take all the transit money just due to maintenance. So they're restricted to no more than 30, and they were also restricted to have to keep paying the historic amount they were rid of, what do you call it, the baseline amount, had to be
Maintenance of effort.
maintained.
That's right.
So they couldn't just stop
Maintenance of
spending their own
effort.
money and just spend the transit money. Those were some of the protections.
And I think that
If a bridge fell apart and I replace it, you can call it new construction, not maintenance.
Yeah, in that context, I guess personally, I would say
Falls a little great.
congestion relief is a bit of a misnomer. In any case, any other questions?
Alex, this really has to do with the next item. I'm just curious, since Ed's here on San Marcos, I'm just curious how I had questions on the RTIP amendments, and we can talk about it. I'm just curious sort of how it's interesting, some good news and bad news on some decreases and increases on the RTIP. And it's nice to have you here to explain.
Yeah, I have to look at it, because I've been at the city of San Marcos for approximately 2 months. So,
No, I
what's first?
I had a couple questions, but
No,
otherwise-
I'll stick around for that, that's not a problem. I'll look at it.
Well, I'd just like to compliment Jonathan and say there should be an above and beyond award given after the kind of effort that you put in on
It's the
this.
city that gets all the cities, the member agencies. Alex has done a wonderful job of working with CCAP. This is really a very excellent report. And I didn't read every letter of the word of it, but it's just what we want.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thank you.
So on RTIP, okay. Sue Albert on.
And I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
That's okay.
It's just a question.
I am responsible for them, so.
I'm sure Sue can tell us.
I'm glad you're here.
Might as well just sit right here.
Sure, why not? Good morning, I'm Sue Albert. At its July 21st meeting, the Transportation Committee is scheduled to approve Amendment Number 6 to the 2016 Transportation Improvement Program. The ITOC is asked to review and discuss the projects included in the proposed amendment, focusing the review on Transnet-funded projects. Amendment Number 6 to the RTIP is the regular quarterly amendment, which includes changes approved for the FY18 SANDAG budget and changes requested by member agencies. It is detailed in the discussion section of your report starting on page 2. This portion details the changes for each project programmed with Transnet funds and, if applicable, provides the amount changed in funding. In attachment 1 of your backup, beginning on page 8, you will find the changes proposed in this amendment specifically for those projects funded with Transnet. Each project includes Transnet funding at the top, followed by any other funding programs on the project. We also show the Transnet subtotals and other subtotals to inform you of how much Transnet and other funds are programmed. I thought that since we do have a new member and as a little refresher, we would walk through a project to just go over what's included in the RTIP. So if you turn to page 25 of your report and look at the first project at the top, the project, the way it's structured, it shows the jurisdiction. So this is the City of Carlsbad project, and the MPOID, which is CB32. It's just the name of the project, the RTIP, the coding. And the project title, this is El Camino Real widening, and the project description is a little bit of the project scope and the limits of the project. The change reason would describe what's happening in this amendment, what's going on. In this case, they added a new funding source and that increased the funding. The next is the capacity status, and it says CI, which means it's a capacity increasing project. And because it's a capacity increasing project, it is not exempt from air quality determination. The total cost of this project there is shown there is $4.2 million, and the open to traffic date is December 2019. On the upper right-hand side, it shows this amendment number, and then the RTP page there, that is the page number of the regional plan that this would be included in as a capacity increasing project. The earmark number is the federal project ID that describes the source of the funding for the earmark repurposing money that was added. And then the RAS number is the page for the regional arterials, because this is a regional arterial. And then this Transnet LSI CR shows that this is considered a congestion relief project, so you can determine congestion relief.
The RTIP number? The 1606, does that represent June of 16?
No, that's just a sequential amendment number, so this is the sixth amendment to the 2016 RTIP.
Okay.
So beneath that, you have the different fund sources on the left-hand side here, and then the total amount of that funding, and then how it's determined over the 5-year period of the RTIP, how it's programmed or planned, and then also which phases that funding would fall into. We have PE right away and congestion as part of the RTIP. You can see here that the earmark repurposing funds were added to this project, and that's the change from the previous amendment, which is down here, which is when it was first programmed in the 2016 update. And then it has the subtotals that breaks out Transnet and other. So is there any questions about? Okay. Okay, back to this. Attachment to Table 2, as shown on page 102, provides the cumulative capacity analysis in regards to revenue versus program of Transnet Local Street Improvement, or LSI funds, through amendment number 6 for all local agencies. There are 4 agencies that have yet to update their programming to reflect the new Transnet revenue estimates provided back in February, and we're working closely with them to correct this in the next amendment. Those are the negative numbers that you'll see here. Also, there are several agencies that are highlighted as being less than 75% programmed for the 2-year biennial or the overall 5-year RTIP program. And they're footnotes to explain what's going on with those cities, if there's any questions about. During the discussion of the previous formal amendment to the RTIP at its meeting on April 12th, ITALC requested information about the percentage change of each project. Attachment 3 is a new, which you can see on page 103, is a new report which lists the total project cost and the revised project cost for each project. So we've got each project with the agency, the title, the before and after revised project cost, then the difference, and then the percent change for each project. So we hope that this would help draw your attention to the projects that you're interested in. And attachment 4 includes a map showing the major local transportation projects included in this amendment. The maps for all the other major projects included were part of the 2018 budget. That's all I had. Are there any questions about those various projects?
No, I thought it was interesting, the new addition that we did was percentages. And it was just interesting on page 108, when I went through the percentage changes, it had City of San Marcos, 865% change. And at the last meeting, we had been discussing sort of the descriptions sometimes of these projects. The descriptions, it's hard to say what is the increase in this, why is it decreasing, why is the number
right. That particular project.
I guess it's a new project. Is that what
no,
it
that
is,
particular project is the match for the state highway bridge program listing. So City of San Marcos programs their match separately, and that would have come up in the previous bridge survey, and the requested increase would have been part of the bridge survey, and then they programmed it on this project.
So it's just, yeah, it was just a number that 865%. And then I noticed San Marcos in particular this time around, is there 9 or 10 projects? Is that high for, is that normal for a city to come in with that number, or at this time?
To amend?
Yeah.
Many of the cities are programming their annual budget in this amendment.
Yeah.
So it's not unusual now.
Oh, that's great. I just was just curious.
You know,
we happen to be here. I just wanted to ask.
And of those projects, 6 of them are kind of grouped, are really a project. It's the Creek District project. So we work on those kind of as a program. So you'll see a lot of changes as money moves back and forth between those individual projects. But it's total, it's a $100 million project.
There's a mechanism in place. It's not just us looking at, oh my gosh, that's 800%. SANDAG and your team, do they look at the change in and evaluate? I assume, and you evaluate. Okay, that's
yeah. This doesn't tell you what fund source. It just tells you the total project cost that's changed. But we look at each fund and each request individually.
So I guess my question would be: because in this instance, we asked for a percentage change. It's sort of a misleading, it's an interesting topic, but then what does
Yeah, I
it
think,
really
you know,
do when you see
maybe one way
865%?
to use this attachment is, this is sort of just the mathematical approach, right? So just without any other criteria, it's just giving you the percent change from what it was to what it's proposed to be. If you want more information within the report itself, there's a brief write-up what the change might be. And so for instance, sometimes we'll have a project where we only have the design up to the design phase funded, and that could be maybe 15% of the total project cost. With the amendment, we're now funding the construction phase. Well, it's not that it's a bad news thing, right? It's actually a good news thing. But if you look at the percent change, it's going to be a substantial, 865% sort of range when that happens. But if you go into the write-up, you'll see, city of such and such is programming their construction phase.
Oh, that's good.
Why wouldn't that have been part of the original budget?
Because sometimes, actually oftentimes, cities will fund only the initial phase to do preliminary engineering work to determine what the scope, ultimate scope, and how you're going to design that project. Mm-hmm. Once you know that, then you know how much, or you have a much better idea of how much that project is going to cost. So at that point, you can go ahead and fund the construction phase.
Also, the programming rules don't allow them to program a phase that isn't fully funded. So if they're looking for a grant or seeking additional funding for a phase, they can't program it until they receive that.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed.
More questions on that?
That's where you're damned to do if you're damned to don't. Because if you try to put a budget for the whole project, then you get criticized for why did it gross or overrun? Because you didn't begin to have enough scope, you didn't deliver engineering.
Amendment 7.
We're bringing a second amendment today, which is an administrative modification that's being processed in conjunction with a formal amendment to expedite approval and allow access to the funds for these projects. The Board of Directors is scheduled to approve amendment number 7 in its July 28, 2017 meeting. The changes proposed in this amendment are detailed in attachment 1 of your backup, beginning on page 3. List up these projects that need to be obligated quickly. Any questions about amendment number 7?
Looks like not. Thank you.
Great.
So as far as next meeting, historically we have canceled the August meeting.
That's correct.
If anybody has a point of view that there are items.
Are there compelling agenda items that you would need to conduct business on in August?
Yeah, that's
Not at this time.
You have vacation plans in August?
Yep. Do we have to vote on that?
You already did, but
Oh, well,
yeah,
okay.
we'll make a note that the meeting has been canceled for August, and your next meeting would be September 13th. September 13th.
because that's a good point, because the performance audit, I think the question did come up about canceled meetings by talk, and we meet 9 or 10 times a year.
10 times a year.
10 times a year, and I think
They're
there
dark in
was
August
a
and
comment
December.
by them saying that we've canceled meetings, and I think that the question was that it's not canceled, it's just this August meeting tends to be slower, and it's and the amount of work that is not necessary to meet, so it wasn't necessarily canceled.
It's kind of like a plan.
Yeah, because the way it read, it sounds like that we're canceling, that ITALC is canceling meetings because we're canceling meetings. Right.
Yeah, so do we, in fresh memory, do we actually vote on at the beginning of the year on a meeting calendar?
Yeah, usually in November, we bring you your meeting calendar for the next calendar year.
So
You do
arguably,
take a
we
vote.
could deal with this at that time and just vote to not schedule
Or if something
Pretty
comes
much
up.
do,
or-
you do vote it that way, so you take into account that you're not planning on having a meeting in August and December. But then, you know, you always have the option of putting it back on the calendar if the need arises, so
So the next regular ITAC meeting is in fact not scheduled.
it's not, it's actually September 13th.
That's the best way to do it. At
So
the
we
beginning of the
need
year,
to-
we know we're not. probably not
That's why
gonna
it's
have
important to
schedule.
ask staff, I think, if it's necessary for us to meet in August, we would, I imagine.
Yeah, you've done that before when there have been time-sensitive items needing your action.
All right, anything else? I guess then